right, hi again, everybody. Well, I just wanted to get us on the same page, on a level playing field, and just kind of ground set us into the topic at hand. Like Shasta said, you've experienced climate change and health impacts in your own community, left and right. But let's kind of do a full wash on the frameworks that we kind of use here at Tribal Climate Health Project and what it might mean, what health impacts might look like within your communities for you to consider. So, all right, so, all right. Oh, that's right. You're right. Okay, so, all of you in here know that there are countless ways that health and the environment are interconnected, and as our global climate changes, we're all experiencing just how much life on Earth depends on and is shaped by climate and our activities on this planet. So when we talk about health, over the last 7 years, the tribes that we've had a chance to work with and worked alongside, learned from, we're always talking about how we're not just talking about Western medicine, especially for tribes, where we see a more holistic view of well-being. And so you all in your tribes have had thousands of years, a long track record and legacy of respect and stewardship of the environment and ways to consider lowering your impacts on future generations. So the tribes we get to work with, they often relay how much the balance and harmony of people and the environment is slipping away in recent years. This is a framework that we like to use at the Tribal Climate Health Project that tries to just simply share visually the cascading effects of climate change, so here on the left. And that's really going to set the framework for how we walk through some of the information we'll discuss together today. So we often talk about primary exposures being an effect of climate drivers on the left. So climate change, greenhouse effect, GHG emissions, contributing to a set of exposures. Exposures meaning climate conditions that your community is going to come into contact with and are changing. And so we usually talk about 5 key primary exposure areas: temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, drought, and melting ice and sea level rise. We've already heard a whole lot about each of those today, and we're going to hear a whole lot more, especially in the breakout sessions that are coming after lunch. From that cascade, another set of effects that we call secondary exposures, and those all express themselves in different ways. So we talk about worsened air quality, vector changes, water insecurity, food insecurity. So for example, a community that expects greater levels of flooding may look out for contaminated water and indoor mold spores. So those are the kinds of things that maybe cascade from those exposures. And then we look at impacts. So those climate conditions are hitting your community. When they come into contact with your community, we look at that in 3 ways. So on the left here is a little tree. That's our icon for natural environment. So we look at impacts to natural environment. Middle is built environment. And on the right is the health and social environment. And I know that we know in this room that all of those 3 things are connected and interconnected. And so under health and social environment, with the advising of all the tribes we've had the pleasure of working with, we know that there's a lot that goes into health. It's not, like I said, just clinical health or Western medicine health. We are talking about physical health. We're talking about mental health. We're talking about socioeconomic health and cultural and spiritual health. And so that's just the way we think of them. And then down at the bottom is the strategies to protect community assets. So that's where we have the power to do something about it. So you all might be out there doing GHG inventories or emission reduction plans to try to lower the impact of climate change and reduce climate change. But you can also work on this level here in your community, trying to safeguard and protect from those impacts as well as you can with strategies. So that's our framework, and we're going to walk through in this section a little bit more about each of those exposures and the kinds of impacts that might come from it. So this is another framework that we like to use to dive a little more deeply into the health information. And so, like I said, tribal definitions of health vary really significantly, but are typically pretty broad and holistic and not just the absence of medical disease. And so in this diagram, you see physical health on the upper left of the middle purple, mental health, socioeconomic health, and cultural and spiritual health. And just some examples of the kinds of things that we're going to end up talking about when we talk about physical health: heat-related illness and mortality, asthma and respiratory illness, vector-borne disease, infections due to contact with ingestions of pathogens, allergies, electricity-dependent individuals that might no longer have access to electricity. So those are all examples of how physical health may be affected by these outer rings, which is the primary exposures and secondary exposures. Shasta is always very good about telling us some examples of effects on culture, and she's free to chime in here, but she's got a croissant right in her mouth. But we'll talk more about this too, and we want to hear this from you all when we get into our breakouts. We think about loss of hunting areas, relocation of villages, canceled ceremonies, impacts to traditional farming, effects on traditional species, and destroyed gathering areas. So this is just to kind of get us a big picture view on the kinds of health impacts that we think about. And I wanted to focus here 1 second too on mental health. At the Tribal Climate Health Project, we have focused on mental health because we think it's one of the greatest sources of suffering that we will experience as a result of climate change, both in the trauma and stress and anxiety that it may induce, but also because there's some neurological effects from some of the disease that we may see higher levels of. So just to mention here, you all are coming from different parts of the country, and we so appreciate having you here. We're going to see effects happening in different ways all over the country. So climate is changing lives differently all over. And I actually, instead of reading this out to you, because I think this is a bit of an outdated diagram, I just wonder if I could get a volunteer from each of these regions to give us a little synopsis. There we go. And tell me if this is a good synopsis. Is this the right synopsis for your region? Or how could you tell us a little bit more about how climate change is affecting lives within your region? Maybe you'll start with Southwest. Anybody from the Southwest?
Well, we know who's from the Southwest because you've all introduced yourselves, and I'm walking over to Virgil. And I'm going to put him on the spot because I love New Mexico.
So repeat the question again. I'm sorry, I was on my cell phone.
Instead of me telling you guys what effects are happening in the Southwest region, what climate impacts are happening, I wanted to hear from somebody within the region. Tell me if this is about right. It says rivers here are fed by spring thaw, runoff, changing trends in river flow threaten the agriculture and tourism industries and could force an increase in reliance on unsustainable natural resource extraction. I think there's more to the story than that.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and start with, Shasta mentions the monsoon seasons that we usually have, probably around like July, August, September timeframes, they usually happen. And when the rains come in that fashion, they come in large amounts. So some of you may have been to my area around Albuquerque. We live in the Mesa country, and when the water comes down from the skies, it just floods those mesas and it fills up the arroyos, and we have a lot of flooding that happens. So in order to slow down that water, we have a lot of check dams, so that usually those check dams are filled to the top, and they help to slow that water down to replenish the aquifers down underneath where we get our drinking water from, and also to feed or have water for the livestock. So that's normally how the monsoon seasons come and give us the rain and the water that we need. But recently we've had very little of that rain that comes through. Somebody talked about microbursts. We did have an incident where one of those came by right near our the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad system runs through our pueblo, and it blew about 17 cars over just from that microburst. The good thing there was no hazmat on there on those rail cars. But those are some of the things that that we're dealing with out there in New Mexico as far as it relates to the climate change and the way things are happening now. One of the other areas is in the oil and gas exploration that's going on around there in the Chaco Canyon area. We've been able to work with the U.S. government and state government to put a moratorium. It's a short-term situation or solution for oil and gas exploration, but that's causing a lot of damage to the environment and contamination to the environment. So that's an issue that we're dealing with. So, those things have impacted the way the weather systems are there in New Mexico. We don't get that much snow as we used to.
Yeah.
The higher countries would get a good sizable amount of snowpack, and during the springtime, the thaw out would fill our reservoirs, because we use the reservoirs to irrigate our crops. And we do flood irrigation. One of the thoughts is that, we need to find a better way of irrigating our crops, maybe through drip irrigation or some other form. But, to take on such a project, we would need to find the funding to help us, develop those types of systems and work with the government, hopefully, to give us that funding. But I was telling a lady here from Washington, was it Sierra, about when we had our little discussion there, that those impacts, they do impact our culture. They do impact our traditional way of life, because the water that comes off of those mesas, we capture that water in reservoirs and we use it to irrigate our crops. And those crops are used in our cultural, traditional aspect. We have the cornmeal that is grind from the corn. Our ladies grind that, and the men take that cornmeal and use it to make prayer bundles and, call on the spirits, the Kachina spirits. We still practice those ways of life in our area, and that's that's one of the things that's being impacted as well. So just wanted to, I'll go that far for now. So I hopefully I answer part of what's up there. Thank you.
Thank you so
No,
much,
that was perfect. Do you want to get another volunteer from a region?
Yeah, you want to do Northwest next?
Yeah, well, because I'm, if I remember your name, you're in trouble. So I'm going to walk back here towards Ryan, because I know you're in the Pacific Northwest. And Angie, it's kind of hard to see from back here. So can you read what it says for the Pacific Northwest so Ryan can either yay or nay it?
It says, climate-induced aquatic changes are altering the ecosystems that support wild salmon, an economic, cultural, and dietary cornerstone of tribes in the area.
There's so much more.
Yep.
We don't have enough time. So, yes, absolutely. But we're also seeing, the gentleman that just spoke, a lot of the same things, even the snowpack we're seeing has a huge effects on loss of foods, because the snowpack is just melting too fast. And when it melts too fast, we have all this runoff and flooding. And we also see the fuel load on the ground, because, we know that our tribes in the area used to do cultural burns. And, 100 years or so, 200 years of that not happening, the fuel load has gotten so bad we have these extreme fires, lots of smoke. But with that as well, logging roads. I was working with Nez Perce tribe, and they're actually trying to decommission logging roads, because even the gravel runoff, when they're no longer used, is going into the water, and it's impacting the fish and blocking waterways. And so, algae blooms. We're seeing a lot of toxicity in shellfish, and even leaching from old sewer systems next to our water, especially in their Washington tribes. You would know if you're from Suquamish. There's just so much. But I want to talk about the cultural aspects of that as well, is so important, because I interviewed about 50 to 60 elders across the 3-state area of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And I think we need to think about this climate change and health, when we talk about, like, there's so much grief. There's so much grief with this. And so I think we need to start thinking about the climate grief, because tribal people see the plants and the fish are literally relatives. They're not, they are relatives. And so they're grieving the loss of roots are burning up because they're not getting enough water. The sun is changing. So there's all these things, and that has that impact, like he was talking about, on practices. And so interviewing all these elders, the number one thing that I found was they said, when we lose the food, that's it. We like lose everything because we're already losing our relatives. We're losing the food because when it comes down to it, that's what we need to survive. And so I just think that impact of that emotional trauma of the loss of these foods. There's so much more, but and I know we have Idaho here too. You guys probably have some different stuff over there if you want to speak about some things going on in Idaho.
Hello, everyone. So I'm from Northern Idaho, and we also have a lot of the stuff that Brian was talking about. A big thing is the water quality issues. We have the runoff from the mines, Silver Valley mines. A lot of our waters are unsafe to go in. As someone was mentioning before, I think you were mentioning that you spoke to someone. We have the same issues of dogs drinking the water and they get sick. There's areas where you're not even allowed to have picnics on the shores of the lake and the river up there. And another issue that we're facing is extreme clear cutting in our forests. It's getting to the point where the companies or the milling companies up there are trying to go into national forests to get their logs. So we're facing that issue. And that leads to a lot of our cultural sites being taken down, a lot of gathering. Let's see, there's a lot. Another big issue is, as Ryan was mentioning, also the cultural side of it. We have our seasonal calendar. I was working this summer with a summer youth program on medicinal plants, and our seasonal calendar is starting to not be accurate because of climate change. So in the spring, when we were preparing for those youth to come in, it was kind of just having to listen to the earth and what it was telling us on when things would be ready, just because our traditional ways were starting to be lost of those signs of when things were ready. Then yeah, salmon, obviously. We didn't have salmon in our water for over a century. That we got 2 in our water about a couple years ago, so that's just a fraction of what we're dealing with up there. But yeah, fish, food, forests, water, it's a big chunk of what we're trying to do.
Thanks.
No, that's great. Thanks,
Northwest.
Ayana.
All right, should we do Alaska?
Yeah, I was going to say, who do I want to pick from Alaska? I mean, I know my buddy Laverne, but I was thinking Johnny. She's like, I know she's going to call on me. You're
All
looking
right.
at, you're
Let
like,
me
I know
tell
it's
you
gonna
what
be me.
the diagram says. Coastal villages are subject to increased flooding and erosion due to ice shelf melting, and warmer temperatures may allow the introduction of new disease vectors. What do you think?
Yes, I think we are experiencing algae blooms in the Bering Strait. They had a moose walk through the village of Teller, which is 6 miles from us. Never seen a moose before with rabies. It was skinny, it was bony, it was foaming down its mouth, brave enough to walk right through. But he was just scared of this animal. But yes, I was mentioning last winter we had gone 12 days. So we're only accessible by air, small airplane, and boat or snow machine in the winter when it ever freezes up. We don't even have snow on the ground. So last winter we experienced 10 or 12 days. I want to say 12 days with no contact from the outside. So no planes coming in. No one. Luckily, nobody got sick or hurt that needed to be medevaced out to Nome. But yeah, we ran out of bread, milk, eggs, regular marbs. Everybody had to smoke menthol. And fish, yes, fish. A real decline in red salmon. That there was a lot of pinks, but due to the extreme rainy summer, didn't hardly get to dry any of our fish, like it dried. So we had to resort to smoking most of our fish, or putting it for winter consumption. Um, we had a good salmonberry harvest, not so much the crowberry, blackberries, and the blueberries too. So that's gonna be an impact next year on our berry crops if we don't get the snow cover. And so,
I see. It's so much more interesting to hear it from you guys than to just read off of a diagram written by some agency.
so we had a Coast Guard station across the bay at Port Clarence. They decommissioned that Coast Guard station. And at the time, they had the tallest radar tower in the state of Alaska, monitoring those rotten Russians. But since that tower's come down, now we are seeing beluga enter our bay,
Hmm.
and minkies and gray whales. So
Thank you. Thanks for that summary. Really helpful.
Can I just comment that I think we're about to do an adaptation plan update, and I think we need to have a section on cigarettes just to make sure that we're not stuck with menthols. Yeah.
Let's do one more person. Anybody outside of those three regions, because I think that's the majority of people here.
And see, I know we had somebody sign up from Leech Lake, so that's the mid-lake, upper Midwest region.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm from northern Minnesota, and the synopsis reads pretty true. By shipping, I think that's pretty specific, and I think that would only be for the tribes that border the Lake Superior. There's no ships that come through our area, but they are introduced by human activity. A lot of the boats that go around the state, they do carry a lot of invasive species that way. It's because of the larvae get stuck inside the boat itself, and then the fishermen have a hard time, just draining that or even practicing that. So, it's just kind of negligence on that part. And so the DNR and the tribes are trying to work together to set up these stations to, I guess, not eliminate, but you're trying to eliminate it, but just tone it down a little bit because, we are getting these zebra mussels. That was pretty a hot topic a few years ago, just because they're filter feeders and it was filtering out all that food that would feed the fish fry, and so we're seeing stuff like that, and that's just really specific too, just regarding the water. We did experience a few droughts. There was a year drought in 2021 that affected our waters. A lot of our water levels dropped so low that our wild rice had a hard time. So we didn't get to open up our wild rice season, and that's one of our main. That's our main substance. That's our staple, and we've been about harvesting wild rice as long as I don't know, forever, and we didn't get to do it that year because the water levels were so low. And then also too, the activity. A lot of boaters they try to cut the wild rice down because they want to fish those waters. So a lot of those we call them chimokamon, but white people, they go through and they try to cut it down so then they can fish better. And so it really does there's a lot of impacts on her. The water levels come through. We do get runoff as well. In my area, we are in the heart of the Chippewa National Forest. So we have a checkerboard reservation. And so our border, it's 900 square miles, and that sounds cute on paper and everything. But our communities are so rural and so far apart that it takes an hour just to go to the next community. And most of our land is owned by the federal government. So we don't even get to manage our own land. There's just small little parcels that we get to do. And that's because of that Dawes Act that happened. And so we don't get to manage the majority of our land. So about, I want to say we own, out of the whole square mile border we own less than 5%. And so even the land management, it takes part on that. And add that to the climate change.
And I'm just going to make an observation on what we've heard. Thank you, everybody who shared or who I put on the spot. I'm noticing a common theme here, and it's not something you see in a lot of climate work that's done outside of tribal communities, and that's culture and also history. The history of tribal people is really relevant to how we're going to manage climate change adaptation, because you're on a checkerboard reservation. There are many that are under those circumstances, and so your tribal trust land is not all that you are. It's the entire ancestral region, and that needs to be considered. So that history is important. The nature of sovereignty is important, but also culture. And I think that's not something you generally see when people are talking about climate change, is the impacts on culture. And that's why I'm glad my friend and colleague Patricia Kennedy is here, who has a tribal working group that is specifically focused on that aspect of climate change planning in California for the 5th climate assessment. But I know that's not true for every state. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's useful to do things in that way where we hear from you, because that diagram I showed earlier, yeah, that's the right container maybe. It shows maybe the right buckets, but it expresses itself so differently within each community. And that's why we do a vulnerability assessment, right? Because the impacts and the trends and the expression of climate change are going to be very unique between each one of your tribes, and I'm a big fan of not leaving blind spots. If you can't see it, you can't solve it. So the majority of this summit, we're really going to be in solving mode, but for the next little bit, we're going to go look at the problems a little deeper and just make sure we're sort of on the same page with the kinds of things that we might be looking out for, particularly when it comes to health. So these are the 5 exposure areas, and I'm going to get through probably just a couple, but you're going to have access to all of these slides. So we'll go through, and I'm going to actually pick on folks a little bit as we go as well. Celso, you had a question.
The last probably 10 years been doing a lot of going to talk about climate change. But I do notice that the audience is who we're talking to, or I talk to. Different audience, different people. But I think this Sunday I was at a youth climate summit. There was films about Mother Earth and the Tuwakacham and what she does for us. And I was invited to speak at the end. But one thing I wanted to say, there is a difference the way tribes look at what's going on with Mother Earth, how we're polluting her, versus what the non-Indians are looking at. There is that difference is so you can tell that may be stopping a lot of things that we can do as tribal people, because we're not in control. We're in control of our areas to an extent, but we're not in control of how we want to deal with climate change. And getting the word out to the ones who are in control is the fight, is the battle, I guess you would say. And that's the local, state, federal, and even worldwide. I mean, it's just, we just don't know how to deal with it. But internally, the tribes, we have ceremonies, we have our prayers, we do everything, salutation. We try to protect her, but the impact of what we do to her is probably our fault as well, because we drive cars and we use electricity. But the major impact is the economy that we're not in control. And I just wanted to bring that, because I've heard that when everybody's talking, they're talking about their point. And that's what it is. We respect her. She is a living organism, but the other ones treat her as real estate and resource.
Thank you, Celso. Totally important. I think that's going to be a theme as we continue along the next couple of days. Just how do we do this alongside local, state, federal actors, and what barriers does that cause? How are we kept from doing the kinds of strategies we know will work? So we'll talk about temperature extremes first here for a little bit. And I think you all know what's going on here, but we know that from various national scale reports that we're going to see an increase, we've seen an increase of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit from the late 1800s to about 2016, and that the projections are expected to increase another 2.8 to 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. So we're going to see an enormous increase in heat. We're also going to see season shifts, and when the heat, not just average heat, but more extreme heat and cold events, and differences in sea temperatures. A lot of the times we talk about the Southwest, but from what I'm hearing, it's really everywhere that we're starting to see extreme heat. And that's what you can see here on the right, which is a little diagram just showing by the end of the century how much change we're going to see in heat. I'm sure a lot of you guys have looked at this. I actually wonder, we have a couple of extreme heat experts in the room, Asamu and Braden, and I wonder if is there anything you want to share from your most recent research about the climate conditions?
Just because I don't think we're doing a breakout later about sensitive populations in particular, I think this is a good chance to talk about how it's not just about the fact that we're going to have higher average temperatures as we've seen this past summer and more frequent and severe heat waves, but also how the negative health impacts of heat don't affect everybody the same way, both because some people have prior conditions that might make them more sensitive to the heat. And just generally, we talked about already how, depending on what region you're from, what extreme heat is to you, and this is like actually literally with how your body is acclimated is different. So 90 degrees for people in one area might affect them a lot more severely than people in another place like Sacramento, where they're like kind of used to that, and that's just a normal day when you'd go to the park. The other thing though is about people's reduced adaptive capacity. So it's a big term, but like your ability to actually change the conditions in your home or in your work environment to make it cooler for yourself. Because with heat, it's really about the long-term exposure. So when you've been hot for more than 12 hours and into the night, when it's puts a lot of stress on your body, especially cardiovascularly. And so folks who don't have air conditioning in their homes or in their workplaces, folks who work in warehouses, outdoor workers, people who are unhoused, people who are incarcerated. There was actually a big report that came out about tribal jails not being having a lot of air conditioning, and so really exposing people to dangerous conditions. Some of those incarcerated people. So it's just important to think about those communities when you're planning for. In addition to just knowing that this is going to continue to be a problem, this is going to be the one that I think in the nearest term is going to be killing people. And so, if this isn't a priority for your tribe, I definitely encourage you to think about that. The other thing is I think some of elderly folks and people who maybe are in assisted living facilities, thinking about how are those facilities prepared, because those people don't have the ability to kind of change and adapt those facilities themselves. They need to actually go to the people who run them.
Thank you, Asamu. So now I'm going to start putting my hat back on as if I'm the person in a community who's going to end up writing a vulnerability assessment and eventually an adaptation plan. What are the kinds of things I don't want to forget when I'm writing this up? Because if you look at it, you see it, recognize it, then you'll remember that you're going to address it later in your adaptation plan. So like Asamu said, when we talk about physical health impacts, we're talking about heat-related illness and death. Some of us outside, we're talking about when it's super hot, you can't get outside, so a decrease in fitness activity levels. We're already starting to talk a little bit about the mental, behavioral, and cognitive effects to well-being. So with heat, we hear a lot in the research about increased conflict, violence, and aggression. I get heat rage. I don't know about you all. Yeah, you just got to go jump in a pool. The thing we haven't talked about yet, and we're going to talk about in each and every one, I think, almost all of these exposures, is power outages and just different kinds of infrastructure impacts that limit access to health services and actually can result in things like carbon monoxide poisoning if you're using some kind of a backup system instead. And really dangerous for those with electricity-dependent medical equipment, so dialysis, for one. Those people might be really stuck and stranded for days, and they don't have that time. Yeah.
Mental health section and kind of like not know what that actually looks like, but and it does look like people being a little bit crankier during the heat waves, but it actually also looks like more road rage incidents during heat waves, and also more alcohol abuse during heat waves. It's a very well-known pattern where it tends to be the higher temperatures are, the more instances they have of like alcohol-related crimes, and so those things are actually related and important to think about with your planning. I know, and especially when you're engaging other people in your tribal government on those topics.
So thank you. And as we're talking, we're really still talking about kind of the exposures, but we're starting to turn the corner to like the health impacts. And I want you to be thinking while you're listening, like what health impacts could you anticipate cascading from these exposures? And so the secondary exposures we often think about when it comes to temperature extremes. For air quality, it's going to be higher levels of ground level ozone, which are exacerbated by heat levels. That is often an effect on health and respiratory health. Allergens, we see different changes in allergy season or the types or levels of pollen in the air. We're going to see different prevalence, breeding prevalence and seasonality and spread of things like ticks and mosquitoes. Where I live, we just started getting our first cases of West Nile virus, which is kind of new. Don't you feel like every week that goes by, you're like, oh, we have to do this now too? Like, new thing, our new normal, right? Water contamination and supply disruption would be a water security issue and food security issue. I heard a lot of you guys already talking about the changes. So for temperature extreme, it's similar, but you might see, if your water systems are starting to heat up, you're going to have more algal blooms, or you're going to have other kinds of contamination. Maybe you can no longer fish where you used to fish, or get your shellfish. And in the long run, we know the whole global crop system is being affected. So even if you're one of those tribes that's no longer reliant upon local food or local harvesting practices, and you're going to the grocery store, we're going to see the prices starting to fluctuate more. We're going to start to see certain foods and crops just becoming less available than we were used to. And so let's think about the health impacts. So those all sound bad, but let's talk about when it hits us, when it hits our community. What does it actually do? What does it actually look like? And I'm going to ask anybody who's feeling like an expert in here to help fill in anything else that I'm missing. So possible health impacts, respiratory illness, of course. So especially when we see high levels of ground ozone. I feel this all the time in my little town in Claremont, which is up in LA. We have some of the worst air quality in the entire country, and my little asthmatic daughter sends me looking to airnow.gov every single day. And so those are conditions that in some cases are improving. We can do things to improve ozone, but at the same time, as it gets hotter, we're going to see worse and worse levels. We're going to see more allergic symptoms from pollen. I hear this one's really tricky to get our heads around. Have you tried to like quantify this at all? I usually go to tribes and talk, and we do adaptation plans together, and it's very anecdotal. It's just, man, my allergies are kicking this year. But difficult to get like a number around it. That's starting to change a little bit. We'll see more infections and illness from contaminated water, like we were talking about algal blooms, and a lack of nutrition and medicinal abundance. Over there on the right, that's a change in ozone-related premature deaths. So it's really hard for you to see it back there, but it's just showing like by the end of the century how much more difficult it will be in terms of air quality and ozone. Up above, that's even old, that's from 2017, but that's Lyme disease, and that's a huge spread from what it used to be, and it's much bigger now. All right, so that's just physical and mental health. Let's talk about impacts to social, economic, and cultural health. And some of you have been talking about this already. So one of the things we think about is displacement. So I don't know if anybody's thinking, well, it's going to get hot enough that I might actually need to relocate. I think we're hearing more about relocation when we hear about coastal inundation and sea level rise. But at least temporary dislocation happens pretty frequently, especially maybe if there's a prolonged heat wave and folks don't have access to power. They might need to go somewhere else for a little while. We see lost school days sometimes. If there's a closure, we see disruptions. A lot of this happens. Disruptions to culturally important activities and species. So I've seen a lot of outdoor gatherings and events get canceled or moved to a different season, or have to change locations from maybe a traditional gathering space. Oak loss, different species lost. In California, I've never talked to a tribe that isn't concerned about their oaks. Economic change and damage. So this can happen in a couple of different ways. Oftentimes we talk about lost business revenues from some of the tribal enterprises. You all are doing various things from agriculture to tourism. We see disruptions to those economic drivers all the time, especially out here in California, including when there's power outages or what we call PSPS events, where you might have 3 days where your major economic driver has to be closed. And on the other end, so not only can you're losing revenue, but you are also incurring tremendous, overwhelming expense that you couldn't possibly have planned for a large enough rainy day fund for an extreme storm or something else. Here's a statistic in California. By 2050, $50 billion a year is going to be associated with human mortality from high temperatures and increased electricity demand, about $200 million a year. So that's just extreme temperatures. And so wanting to hear from you all a little bit, how else might cultural well-being and traditional ways of life be disrupted by extreme temperatures? What did I miss?
Here in Paula, every May, the first weekend in May, we have Koopa Days. And you think it's the first weekend in May, it's still spring, so it should be okay. We invite people from all over the region to come in and share culture and tradition, and a lot of that includes singing and dancing, and it's outside. And there have been times in May where it is in the triple digits in the first weekend of May. And so that makes it really hard to be able to safely do those things, even if you're not running a marathon, but you're still moving. And so, we haven't yet had to cancel a Koopa Days, but I'm looking at my friend George from San Isabel. You've had gatherings up in your area, which is up in the mountains here, and sometimes same thing, it gets so hot. Yeah, it gets so hot that it's not safe for anybody to be singing and dancing, even though the dances, and when there's social dances, I'll sometimes go out and dance. When the women are dancing, they're just sort of, bouncing a little bit, or moving their feet a little bit. But seriously, your heart rate gets up. You start to sweat, and, the bird singers will look at you and be like, one more? And you're like, please, not one more. I want to take a break. No, we're going to mess with you. We're going to see how long the white lady can keep dancing, I will say, too, when it comes to rage, I get rage when it's cold. When it's hot, I don't have the energy to fight. But if it's cold, I'll kick you. No. But, yeah, and does anybody else want to share an example? Yes, also. Tina, you should just hold that microphone and then hand it to him.
So I came to participate. So the saguaro cactus. Saguaro is the autumn. It's a living being. Our resolution says it's us when we pass, and so the heat has impacted the growth of it that we're starting to lose our saguaros, and that's not. We thought that would be the saguaro will be the threshold of the heat. Like if it goes, then we know that it's going to be climate. Well, it's not just the heat; it's the soil moisture starting to get to the point where plants can't grow. So we're watching our food because we eat the fruit. Part of our wine ceremony that we bring the ocean water to the people. And so we've seen that impact, and I'm working with the National Park Service, and we just don't know what's going on. We think it's a combination of the heat, combination of lack of soil moisture, but what's happening to us culturally is we're watching it die in front of us. So we have areas on the reservation where they're starting to fall, and it's really strange because we thought that they will outlast anybody, everybody, even us. But the impact is.
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how hard this is. I hear these stories and I just want to cry. And I don't want to diminish the importance of it, but I also want to say where I take hope. I think that's important, and I take hope in the fact that you're here sharing, and that we're all here together, trying to do something about this. Because I don't want to just go home and cry. I want to feel inspired to do something. But those losses are intense, and it's what we're seeing. Angie mentioned the oak trees in California, new pests coming in, drought, fire. And oaks are relatives. You don't want to see those things be lost. So I think it's also important to do what Johnny did, where she said some of our that big radio tower was taken down. The minke whale, the gray whale, the beluga whales are coming back. So sometimes good things can happen. Just nobody wants to talk about the planes that land. We just want to talk about the planes that crash, right? But we got to remember we are having some safe landings too. But so also my heart hurts to hear about the saguaro. Anybody else want to make my heart hurt? All right.
She says with
Yay!
a smile.
Thanks, Randy.
No, I just wanted to share at our last Tribal Leaders Summit that happened, we showed a film about Little Diomede Island, which is in northern Alaska. It's right between Russia and Alaska. It's two little islands. One of the interesting things about that is like one island is in one time zone, the other one's in another, but they have had a lifetime of a reliance upon the walrus as not only a food source, but materials for creating their art. The tusks from the walrus provide that ivory and the hides, and they have literally seen their whole walrus population pretty much disappear in the last 10 years or maybe even more, but there's no sea ice there to support them, and that whole community now is facing economic burdens, and then you can't even imagine higher suicide rates because they can't hunt, they can't feed their families, there's depression, there's so much that is affected by the loss of our traditional food sources, and not just the food, because it's our relationship to those animals and the other things that they sustain our communities with. So it's sad, and I'm sorry to make you cry, but it's a great film too. Maybe I'll share it if I can find the link.
Yeah, thank you. And we cry, but I think one of the things I learned at the Tribal Climate Camp in Washington, which I feel like was a life-changing experience, is that we all swim together. This is one of the stories that was told by Amelia Marchand, who's tribal member in Washington, and for some reason I'm blanking on the name of her tribe. Thank you. And that's what I think. We all swim together. You don't make it over the dam alone. You don't make it to the spawning grounds alone. We all swim together, and we'll keep swimming together to try to do something about the walrus, about the saguaro, and then when we're done, we'll take a nap.
Yeah, Shasta and I always like to hold space for the sad, because you can't do this work and be too impervious to it. I know for me, I let it motivate me. So we're gonna, we'll steep here in the sad a little longer. Then we're gonna have lunch, And then we're going to roll up our sleeves. Then we're going to see what we can do about it.
Oh, Lisa. Yes.
The things that have been brought to my forethought aren't really having to do with sad. Mine make me mad. The thoughts that I've been having make me mad. And I'm going to start with a couple of things. I was when my brother from Leech Lake was talking, he was talking about Chalmakulman, Chamukaman. And I leaned over and I said, that's an invasive species. And I think, and that's what I've been thinking of all along. What I don't want us to forget is the history. And the reason that I say that is because the community I work for now, a river flowed through it. And the invasive species came in and said they got a better idea. They're going to dam it up. And so there's no river. There's no river to speed. It doesn't flow like it used to. And I'm angry about that. And I don't know how not to be angry about that. And here's the other thing is because and I'm a white people, so I can talk about us. We look at problems, and I'm looking at these maps and stuff, and I'm going, that means nothing to the elders that I talk to, or the children, the youth that I'm going to talk to, because it means nothing that we're going to raise, the temperature is going to raise 1 degree. What?
Doesn't sound like a lot. Yeah.
It is not the way to tell the story. It has to be brought home, because 31 days of over 115 degrees, can you imagine? I couldn't imagine, but I lived through it, which makes me resilient. I'm not sure. Air conditioner made me resilient. Not going out, not getting activity, the 10 pounds that I gained. But that's not even the thing. We've had climate disasters since the invasive species came over, and so I'm gonna, during the invasion, 1500s, a lot of us peoples died. We died. There was a genocide that came across, and it was intentional. And I don't care what anybody says, oh, that was disease. Y'all just couldn't take it. Well, bullshit. Y'all gave us blankets to kill us. You saw it and you did it and you kept doing it. And you came in and ate the corn and we got you through the hard times and you killed us. And that's the story that you need to, I know there's a lot of folks from the States that are going, oh, isn't this wonderful? I'm gonna go talk with these Indians and learn this stuff. And I'm going, wait a minute. Know what your history is. Know who you are and address that problem. Address that problem that you're considered an invasive species. I have loved ones here, so you guys know what I'm saying. You're an invasive species, not just you. I am one too. And so we have to figure out how to live simply that others may simply live, because it's our greed and our waste that keeps this going. And Angie brought up the we have these damages to foods and crops. What's the number one thing that goes to the landfills? You state people know this. Food. So let's just stop growing so much. Let's stop wasting so much. Let's get real about what the problem is. And the problem is in the mirror. Mr. Jackson had a lot of problems, but that was it. The problem is in the mirror, and I'm gonna so with in my old age, I get to yell at you guys for this kind of stuff. In my old age, I get to call you out on it because I'm doing the same thing, and I make the adjustments for myself because I too am a United States citizen consumer. But let's really get to the meat of things. The meat of things isn't spreading a risk across the United States. The way to address these things is right there at home where you can, because 1.68 degrees Fahrenheit over 100 years means nothing. Means nothing.
Yeah.
Quit thinking that the scientists have the way to talk about this and that we can't get emotional about it. I'm emotional and I'm mad and I'm sad. And it matters. But we've been facing climate disasters from the invasion time. I wanted to end with the hope. One of the other things is I'm Pawnee and Comanche. I think I forgot to say that. I work for a different tribe, so it confuses people when I say who I am, and so I usually don't do it in a mixed crowd. No, I'm a white people too. There was one other thing that I wanted to say that was important. There was an intentional murder of the buffalo. For those of us who depended on buffalo, it was absolutely devastating. And so this climate stuff that we're looking at today is PTSD. We have done this over and over. We've tried to resolve these things over and over again. When you take our rivers, you take our buffalo, you take our families, you hurt us in every kind of way. It's I don't know. I don't even know what to say. Here's one of the things that I was hoping that my little thing of hope, and it reminded me the gentleman from Laguna. My heart lives in Albuquerque, by the way, in the Sandia Mountains. My family's, that's where my my grandchildren are. One of the things that I know that we can do and that I've done is, I can't save the world. I really can't. I can't save the tribe that I work at. They, you know what? They can be okay, whether I'm there or not. But I can bring some stuff that I learned from other places, like I understand some of the peoples that are in New Mexico used to dig out trenches. And then they'd line the trenches with big rocks at the bottom, and the next size rocks, and the next size rocks, and the next size rocks, till we get to pebble. And that's where they planted corn. And they planted their corn. These areas were on the sides, at the edges of the mesas, where they had observed that when the clouds come in, that it tends to rain more, right there at the edge of those mesas. And so when you take pieces of information and materials like and try to replicate what they were using, which is cultural knowledge and scientific knowledge, even if it wasn't a scientist figuring it out, it was still scientific knowledge, and you apply it and put it in. We're doing a vegetable garden at the office at my department where we work, and that's what we did. Dug out a hole, put some of the bigger rocks down at the bottom, and then layered it, and we have a bed, so that we can capture and maintain moisture for longer, because oh my gosh, it's hot. It's really hot there. But there are things that we know to do, that we take from each other, that we're going to be okay. When we don't have walruses, well, what do we got? We go get what we got. What's there? What Creator is making sure that we have, and go from there. And we lose a lot, and we suffer a lot, and it's not fun. It's sad. And if I'm mad, I'll get over it. I mean, I don't stay mad. I get mad, but I don't stay mad. Thanks for letting me have my say.
Thank you, Lisa. Also, I love you, and I'm glad you're here. And yeah, it's tough stuff. I'm going to just distill that into my rallying cry, which is partly tongue-in-cheek, but kind of not, and I think it relates to what Celso said, and it's overthrow capitalism. With that, I will send it back to Angie.
I have no elegant segue back from that important thing that was just said, other than, how many of you are sad? How many of you are mad? Do you use it in your work? Me too. Me too. I'm not going to go through the rest of the exposures, other than to maybe touch upon some ways that this looks a little different from each of those exposures. Just a quick breeze through, and then we're going to do lunch. When we come back, we're going to break up by these 5 exposures, and we're each going to have a chance to kind of round robin and talk to each other about what are we doing about it? What are we doing about heat? What are we doing about wildfire? So you all know about wildfire. We think about it most in the western portion of the United States, including Alaska. You know, it's getting worse, more frequent, more extreme, and the burn season is longer. And I can imagine you know a lot about the health impacts already too. Some of the direct impacts could be things like wildfire-related injuries and deaths. We actually hear about it now. We actually hear about people dying pretty regularly, almost to the point where I think it doesn't blip the news cycle as much as it should. Mental health impacts here too. A RAND study found that 1/3 of adult survivors of California wildfires in 2003 suffered depression and 1/4 suffered PTSD. And these are some of there's like short-term mental health impacts, and then there's these long ones that last and last. And then this is what we talk a lot about, what both wildfire and storms and flooding. We talk about the disruption to critical infrastructure or closure of things like disruption of power, disruption of roads, disruption of, we're not just talking, we don't care about roads for the sake of roads. We care about roads because that's your evacuation path. That's how you're going to get to work. That's how you're going to get back home. That's how you're going to get emergency services in, or communication systems. When those go down, how do you have access to information about what to do next or where to go for help? And so the related climate exposures, the secondary exposures, look a little different when we talk about wildfire. So temperature extremes, we talked a lot about worsened air quality in the form of ozone. Here we're talking about particulate matter. I look at that all the time on airnow.com as well. And we talk about smoke. So smoke is made up of particulate matter, but made up of a lot of other things too, including toxins. And you could be miles and miles and miles and miles away from a fire and still feel the impacts of it. You can imagine the kinds of health impacts that might result in. We talk about ticks and forest pests. Wildfire has an impact on that and the prevalence and the breeding rates. Water contamination, supply disruption. If you've ever been around after the aftermath of a wildfire, you know that the debris oftentimes finds its way into a waterway, contaminating that with all the various runoff and that came down from the fires. Water, and then food contamination or food supply issues as well. Again, with the runoff and potential waterways affecting our fish, but you might just see entire food agricultural operations be affected by wildfire burn. So similar kinds of things to look out for when we're talking about health impacts, but I'm going to only point out the things that I think are unique. So we already talked a little bit about respiratory and cardiovascular illness. Of course, who's been in a wildfire smoke situation and felt good? I've had to leave multiple times, whatever town I'm in, for a while, especially with asthmatic kids. We don't often talk a lot, and I know we talk a lot about it in Southwest, but valley fever is something that we're seeing growth, higher prevalence levels. It's a fungus. It's an airborne fungus that oftentimes might get released during a wildfire. So wildfire can exacerbate that. You might see incidences of valley fever, which is a disease that has affected a lot of the tribes here in the Southern California area. Let's see. Let's just kind of keep rolling along. Huge opportunity here for displacement and destruction, including of historical sites and cultural resources. Disruptions to culturally important activities again. So I know we all have a unique relationship with wildfire. So none of us in the room think wildfire is necessarily bad, right? Wildfire is an important part of the natural cycle, but we do know that it declines and stresses certain habitats. It can affect waterways or important sensitive plant and wildlife species. And again, humongous opportunity for economic damage. So you're starting to see the kinds of stuff we talk about repeat. I'm really just thinking back to, all right, you're the staff person, going home, going to your office, going to write up a vulnerability assessment. What kinds of things should you make sure you mention? You have to be intentional about including some of these things. I see a lot of reports, years ago, many reports didn't talk about any of this stuff. And so there is data out there. There's ways to find out more information about the rates that it's happening, and that could be internal or it could be external. It could be a publicly accessible from some state or federal agency, or you probably have your own records, and you probably have your own observations, and maybe even your own TEK to pull from to learn more about how this is changing and what it might mean in the near future and longer term. All right, with that, I think there's a lot more to talk about in terms of impacts. I think in the interest of time, I think lunch is here. Yeah, is that lunch? Actually, it's getting set up. I want to ask one question here about storms and flooding, since it's a really important one. I actually think most parts of the country are experiencing storms and flooding, but they look so different, right? So we talked about habooms versus monsoons. There's atmospheric rivers. There's a polar vortex. There's, well, that's not really a storm. Tornadoes and hurricanes. Where you live, you have your own flavor. This year we got a hurricane in Southern California. That was fun and new. I wonder what health impacts you all either can anticipate or have seen as a result of storms and flooding. Let me just shout them out.
Go ahead, Christian.
Mold exposure after a long time. So that's something that people don't really understand is correlated through storms and flooding. So mold exposure, black mold, damage to infrastructure, like you were mentioning, those are just a few things to mention.
Yeah, that's that different flavor of worsened air quality. In this case, we're really talking about indoor air quality rather than PM 2.5, particulate matter, or ozone, spores.
Has anybody ever had their sewage system or their wastewater treatment plant get so overwhelmed with floodwaters that it ends up backing up into your water system? Yeah, that's always fun.
You know, maybe Lori could tell us a little. She mentioned cyanobacteria, and I feel like storms and flooding is where we see a lot of that. Do you want to share a little what you know?
Well, we see a lot of the cyanobacteria after the storm in warm weather. That grows, but the contamination of waterways and contamination of drinking water also as a result of the storms.
And you know what I often think about? Lots of things. You don't want to live in my head, but the fact that when people lived fully in traditional ways before the invaders, before the capitalist system, and I'm not going to get too into the socialism thing, but we just drank straight from the river. We drank straight from the groundwater, the well, the spring, the lake, the pond, and now you have people that come to your house and they're like, can I get a glass of water? And they see me fill it with the tap and they're like, oh, don't you have bottled water? And no, I don't. Now I know there's places where the tap water is not safe, but it's not here where I live. So, I think we're kind of wussy. But nonetheless, I'm not going to drink from a water system that's been contaminated by an overwhelmed wastewater treatment plant. So yeah, there's a lot of things. It's not just about drowning. It's not just about property destruction. It's about health. And that's the part that's been missing from a lot of climate adaptation planning, which is why we're talking about it today.
So we have a lot of resources when it comes to these impacts that we can share with you. We have a whole report that we wrote, Shasta's Vulnerability Assessment, which is publicly accessible in Word. You could literally just grab it and take some of what we've already written up and customize and adapt it for yourself. It's really attempting to lift the burden off of you. We have different tools and things to help you with making sense of all the different data sets that are out there to really determine how severe and likely all these things are and what you should really prepare for. But that was more last year's summit where we dove really deep into that. But we have a recording of that whole summit if you want to be steeped into the how do we know what's really wrong and what's the worst and thinking ahead in terms of what do we really need to focus on addressing.
I just want to say it wasn't Shasta's vulnerability assessment. It was the vulnerability assessment for the Paula Band of Mission Indians. My vulnerability is that I'm going to die in my sleep and get eaten by cats. And I'm not sure how to prevent that, but if you guys have any ideas, let me know. And chicken. Well, the chickens are outside, but the cats are inside, and they're probably going to eat me while I'm still alive, so.
I'm not going to talk much about drought other than this one's the slow go one, right? This one is less extreme than a wildfire in terms of you're not going to wake up one day and see it on the news. You're going to experience the long haul of it and see it coming like we are here in the Southwest, where we're seeing lots more days of dry days. We are seeing changes in precipitation levels, of course, and there's an interrelationship here with storms and flooding and drought. People are like, wow, we just had a really big storm. There's no drought. Well, actually, no. We're just seeing extremes on both ends. Longer dry periods, and then when the rain comes, it really, really comes, and it's intense. And it's almost worse than it would be if there wasn't that dry period, right? Because then we get all the scourging and all the runoff and all the erosion. This one is just one I want to mention. I think a lot of you have talked about sort of the sadness and the various grief associated with climate change, and everybody, almost every region here talked somewhat about water, and water is life. Well, access to water is key, and just there's plenty of research on this, but you all know that mental health impacts might look like anxiety, grief, and helplessness. And then, of course, I actually think here in California, we got to be thinking really long term that one of the major impacts to the tribes that is really hard to actually see is water insecurity. And so folks like Chris and I and some of the state folks, we talk about how do we visualize this better? How do we get a better eye on this issue? Because it's really hard to get information on your groundwater levels, your aquifer recharge. We know it because we're experiencing the drought. But how many years do we have left before this is such a tremendous issue? We might actually have to renegotiate our treaty rights or somehow otherwise
right.
relocate, right? Like all these things that are impossible, right? Or something big.
Yeah, in California, we don't have ratified treaties. So, that's, anyway. Nikki, you wanted to say something.
Well, I think I would disagree a little bit there. You can see it. Earlier, you were saying experts, and I don't know if you were just pointing out to the EPA or state agency people, but there's experts in here. I know Celso has a PhD, but he also has a PhD in probably like the land and experiencing it. And so one of the health impacts that's not up here as well is food. We don't have access to our sheep and our cattle because we have to sell them off, because we don't have the water to feed them. We don't have hay to supplement their feed. Well, we do, but there's a high cost to that. So I think that should be one of the health impacts up there too. And then my friend here from Leech Lake was also saying, with 2021, you had that drought or that high temperature year where they experienced, no mosquito bites but more bee bites. And then in 2023, this year, regular season, normal, a high increase in mosquito bites.
Yeah.
Because they're all awakening. So you can see the impacts of drought through people who live on the land can see it and feel it and know it.
Absolutely.
You don't need those water measurements. You don't need those things to really know what the health of the environment is or the water levels. My grandma could tell you because she's my long-term monitoring network is what I called her. She knows exactly what the water, you can see it. So that's what my point is. So we should put that up there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I think I will just say it's hard a little bit to thread the needle. I'm thinking very hard about what Lisa was saying and about all of the things that had to happen for us to be in this place, both as individuals and as communities. And there's the one side where for somebody like me, as somebody who works for a tribe and needs to put together that adaptation plan, I am looking at the science and the graphs and all those things to say, okay, this is what the science says about our vulnerabilities. But like Lisa said, that's not the story I'm telling to the community. I even had to say that to my mom. She says, well, what's the big deal of 1 degree Celsius? Like, well, 1 degree Celsius is 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Or something like that. She's like, okay, what's the big deal about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit? And I actually was a little bit tongue-tied. I'm like, well, shit. Oops, I was supposed to save that. Oh, it's just now noon. So yes, woo, I made it through the morning. And we have to tell the story. And that's something I think we all struggle with. I mean, how many of you think it's easy to bring this information to your communities and get them to understand it? I was hoping somebody would raise their hand so I'd be like, cool, you're teaching now. It's not easy because we're not, if we tell them with this language, you know, and then this language is for this group because we're supposed to be the experts. We're supposed to be learning how to figure out this stuff, but we've got to tell the story. We have to use the traditional knowledge. We have to go to people. And that, to me, that's where the story comes from, which is what was it like here 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? I have a tribal elder who is a friend, and I will talk to her. She's in her 70s now. So when I was your age, she thinks I'm young. Thank you. But this was years ago. You know, when I was in my 20s and 30s, when it got hot, we would go and jump off the bridge, the swinging bridge, into the San Luis Rey River. You can do that now and you'll land on the sand and you'll regret your choices because that's changed. The river used to flow. It doesn't flow anymore in her lifetime. And that's what's telling us what's wrong. And for folks like Celso, who live in a beautiful state of Arizona, it's so beautiful there. I love the desert. And yet you've got Phoenix with 3 million people. That environment is not meant to support 3 million people. So that's something else we have to adapt to, right? So the bigger picture is what we've got to talk about if we're going to get people to understand it. But we still have to use data. Or maybe we don't. You know, I don't know. Maybe we don't. But we have to talk about to our leaders, the people who are making decisions, and especially the funding agencies who are going to give us money to implement strategies. This is what's going on. This is what proves it. So we can get some help. So we're trying to straddle that line, and it's hard. You know, sometimes it's like riding a bike and you fall off the seat and you just hit yourself right on that bar in the middle. And if you're a dude, that really hurts. And if you're a woman, it hurts too, just not in the same way. But that's what I feel like. I feel like we're trying to not hit that bar, and it's hard. It's hard.